Hello, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today. This webinar is being hosted by the Interdisciplinary Global Development Center, also known as the IGDC at the University of York. My name is Sabha Joshi, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations and Deputy Director of the IGDC here at the University of York. So before we start our session today, I would just like to say a few words about our center, and then I'll hand over to the chair of this event, Professor Sara De Jong. So the IGDC is an interdisciplinary research community for equitable global development based at York. We undertake interdisciplinary research focused on social justice, global health, and sustainable environments. Our center brings together researchers from across the university based in the faculties of humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences, and also globally. To become a member, you can visit our website, www.york.ac.uk/IGDC, and also follow us on Blue Sky. As a member, you'll hear about the events, our events, such as this, public lectures and workshops that we organize, which often focus on bringing together researchers and practitioners working on global development. So before introducing our panel today, I'll just mention a few housekeeping points. This session is being recorded, but only the video and the audio of the panelists is being recorded. Attendees' mics are muted and your video is off, so you won't be recorded. The only information that may be recorded are any questions that you type in that may include your name, which could be identifiable based on your Zoom name. To ask questions, please click on the Q&A button in the bottom bar. The panelists will answer questions using that function. So now I'll hand over to the chair of this session, Sara De Jong, who's a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of York. Over to you, Sara.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to introduce and especially welcome our panel for our webinar today. So just to kind of remind ourselves of why we're here, in recent months, the global development system has witnessed major upheavals under the US government, under Donald Trump, but also following the US freezing of all foreign assistance and shutting down its 60-year-old US Agency for International Development. European countries like the UK, who are also increasingly under pressure to increase defense spending, have followed suit by cutting overseas development aid. The implications of these very profound changes in the lives of the most vulnerable groups on the global population, planetary crises, and future of development cooperation comprise the subject of this IGDC webinar. We invited three experts that you can see on the screen here: Indrajit Roy, who's a professor at the University of York; Duncan Green, who's a professor at the London School of Economics; and Sayed Jalal Shajjan, who's a journalist. They will share their perspectives on the impact of these changes on global development and humanitarian assistance. I will introduce the speakers in slightly more detail in the order in which they will speak today. Before I do that, I also want to note that I'm conscious that today we have a panel, i.e. a panel that comprises solely of men, which is in a way not quite in accordance with the spirit of the IGDC that is very keen to always have diversity in its events and in its workshops. At the same time, we at least don't have a panel fully of white men. We have a group of diverse speakers in that sense. And the speakers are also diverse, and that will become obvious when I read out their biographies, in the sense that all of them have experience as intellectuals, as thinkers, but also very practical experience. So all of the speakers today are wearing different hats, and I'm sure that they will let their expertise from those different parts of their experience, professional experience and personal experience, bear on their presentations today. So I'm starting by introducing Indrajit Roy, who is a colleague of mine in the department, and he has worked in the development sector for 7 years prior to undertaking his doctoral studies at the University of Oxford. Since obtaining a doctorate in development studies, he has held the ESRC Future Research Leader Fellowship at the Oxford Department of International Development, as well as a Junior Research Fellowship at Wolfson College, University of Oxford. His research and his teaching contribute to critical approaches to studying the changing politics of global development. At the University of York, Indrajit's research has been interdisciplinary, and has examined the intersections of power and agency at the global, national, and local level. Much of his work has been informed by fieldwork in India, and I know today he draws a bit also on that Indian perspective, of which he continues to be a citizen. He has worked with colleagues to produce an open access edited volume with Oxford University Press on Chinese investments in Europe, which helps to understand the transforming nature of global developments rather than international developments in the context of the changing world order. He's also currently co-writing a textbook on global development politics for Routledge. Indrajit is a trustee of the Political Studies Association and of the British Association of South Asian Studies, BASAS, an executive member of the International Political Studies Association, and a counselor of the Development Studies Association, also known as the DSA. The second speaker is Duncan Green, who is a professor in practice at the International Development Department in the London School of Economics, and the LSE's Feroz Lalji Institute for Africa. He recently ended 20 years with Oxfam GB as a head of research and strategic advisor. I mean, if that is not combining different hats, I wouldn't know what it is. He is a director of the Global Executive Leadership Initiative course on influencing, run by UNOPS and hosted by the LSE, which since early 2022 has been training handpicked groups of senior leaders at national level, UN, INGOs, Red Cross, Crescent, and national NGOs, to become more effective in influencing government, societies, and the international system. He's an advisor to building community engagement in Papua New Guinea program on strategy theories of change and mentoring for senior leadership, and undertakes various consultancies around influencing advocacy and campaigns for Chatham House, the Asfari Foundation, and others. And last but not least, Sayed Jalal Shajjan, who is a journalist and a development practitioner with over a decade of experience in the humanitarian and development sectors. He's a recipient of the Concordia Prize for Human Rights, and his writing as a journalist has appeared in Al Jazeera, Vice, and The New Arab, where he explores the human cost of conflict and displacement. Sayed is underselling him, I think, himself in the bio that he has provided. He is also a co-author on academic articles, and he has worked on the plight of former Afghan interpreters who have worked with US forces and looking at the challenges to their protection, especially in light of the cutting of US aid. And he will speak about it today as well. Every speaker will take about 10 minutes, which will give us the opportunity, hopefully, for the speakers to respond to each other and pick up any themes that emerge, and of course for the audience to ask any questions they may wish to raise. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Indrajit.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to IGDC generally for inviting me and having me on this panel. I approach this question as both an insider and an outsider, having been part of aid delivery projects, but also having studied some of their impacts. On the one hand, I've seen firsthand the problems associated with aid, the arrogance of aid officials, the arbitrariness with which they approach their work, and the way they parachute in and out of the societies and countries in which they work. On the other hand, and here if we, following Amartya Sen, put the human dimension of development first, despite all its problems, aid can and does reach people in need and has been a force of good. Now, these two mutually contradictory aspects of aid contextualize the very polarized perspectives on aid that we have seen in recent weeks. By way of clarification, I should also say that the practice of aid, not the ideas that we might have of aid, but the practice of aid often defies very neat dichotomies. One view of aid has been that it is an unadulterated good that spreads the milk of human kindness among the needy and the poor. An opposite view has been that it's a nefarious plan of aid donors to world domination and subjecting recipients to their machinations. However, like any human endeavor, aid is a bit of both. More important, perhaps, aid has always been subject to intense negotiations, appropriations, and politics. Countries with relatively weak material resources have sought and received aid using and exerting their agency. And that's something we should never forget. In the next few minutes, I want to pinpoint attention to three themes. One, the increasingly pluralized landscape of official development assistance. Second, no doubt the fact that USAID winding down is a shock to the system, but is part of a wider landscape of reduced ODA from the DAC countries, the development assistance countries. And here I want to be clear that this reduction is not motivated by any emancipatory zeal. And third, I want to reflect a bit on what happens next. So the first part, to think about the landscape of aid, it is increasingly pluralized. There's absolutely no question of that. If you see figures from the Development Assistance Committee, of course, the Global North countries continue to lead the field of aid. The US was the lead donor, followed by Germany, France, Japan, the United Kingdom. You have the European Union, the Scandinavians, who have always been very generous, relative to everyone else in terms of the proportion of the gross national income they disperse, the South Koreans, the South Europeans, Canadians. But beyond these so-called traditional donors, you also have other donors that are called non-traditional donors, the Chinas, the Indias, the United Arab Emirates, the Turkeys. And there are complications in how we measure their aid, the aid that they gave and what exactly that means. But I think we should be clear that the aid landscape does not only rely on the USAID or the DAC countries. It also reflects the changing world order, the transition of economic power away from the global north. And when we talk about aid cuts, we might want to think about the very specificity of Euro-American aid that we are talking about. That said, and in part two of this talk, I want to talk about the obvious fact that US bilateral aid, not only US aid, but also aid given by US development assistance and other US mechanisms, is among the largest. It's almost a third of all DAC recorded ODA. Even if all other ODA, that is the traditional and the non-traditional ODA is included, USAID would still have the largest share. So suspension of USAID is obviously a major shock to the system. This is especially the case in the lower income countries, the LICs, where USAID assistance often constitutes up to 1/10 of their economies. But you also have the lower and middle income countries where projects that were supported by USAID will find themselves suspended, which obviously means a lot of sunk costs and what ultimately would be a wasteful expenditure. Now, to be perfectly clear, as I've already alluded previously, the aid system is quite broken with inefficient bureaucracy, strings attached, a poor understanding of local context, and often the goals of these associations, these organizations are also quite murky. USAID itself was initiated. One of its primary goals when it was started out in 1961 was to encourage the development of market economies in countries not dominated or controlled by the international communist movement, and to open those countries to markets of American goods. But as I've already sort of alluded, USAID did not always succeed in becoming the handmaiden of American capital. As new histories of such things as the Green Revolution in places as diverse as Mexico, India, and elsewhere document. USAID and assistance, or aid dispersed by any country for that matter, was often subject to intense negotiations and was appropriated by local contexts, countries, and people to suit their needs. So to think about aid as this thing that always came in parachuting on the backs of nefarious politicians from the West needs a considerable amount of nuance. Even if we accept, and I agree, that the aid system is broken, what it needs is fixing, not dismantling altogether. And we should be under no illusion. USAID was dismantled not because it represented a broken aid system that was unresponsive to poor people in the lower income countries or the lower middle income countries. It was wound down because even this broken system was not seen as conducive enough to promoting American or Western interests. It represents what some of us have been calling an elite revolt, a phenomenon to describe the ways in which dominant groups, or at least a section thereof, exemplified by what is often called Washington's broligarchy, to resist even a modicum of social support to impoverished, marginalized, and vulnerable communities. So let's not sort of forget that at all. In part three, in the remaining couple of minutes, I want to reflect a bit based on this background on what happens next. Like I said, when we say aid is being cut, we should probably be clear that we're talking about Euro-American aid being cut. Even so, no one country or bloc can fill the shortfall that's caused by USAID's exit. It has sometimes been suggested that the Chinese might step in, but Chinese aid is much smaller than USAID's outlay and is often wrapped up in strings, concessions, and whatnot. Indian aid often comprises more lines of credit rather than what might actually be called aid. But of course, to be fair, USAID support and other ODA was never really no strings attached. So in a sense, we may see not a very great tangible difference. What will happen, though, is USAID's exit likely spurring countries to explore alternative avenues for development finance. Bangladesh, for instance, a major recipient of DAC ODA, joined the BRICS-led New Development Bank, this large infrastructure bank that was set up as often considered to be an alternative to the World Bank. Bangladesh joined this in 2021, partly to increase its financial alternatives. Ethiopia, another major recipient of aid, US aid and other DAC aid, joined the BRICS last year, eyeing the loans that it could secure from the New Development Bank. The long-run strategy of both countries seems to have been to recognize the arbitrary nature of aid and to explore alternative sources of development finance, and this will likely be followed by other ODA recipients or former ODA recipients. A second alternative that countries will no doubt pursue is to let their territories be used for transnational infrastructure building. We've already seen the flurry of countries, including those who will be most impacted by the withdrawal of USAID, joining the China-led Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, across Asia and Africa. USAID's departure has left these countries with little option but to seek out other such projects. Of course, let's not forget that countries do have agency, so it's not only the BRI that they will seek to join, but there's a surge of infrastructure projects across Asia and Africa, financed by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the African Development Bank, etc. And countries are likely to join these as partly to meet their development needs. Ironically, of course, this will mean a greater focus on infrastructure development, and human development initiatives are likely to take a back seat. But of course, just to be very clear, countries will not be waiting haplessly for the next savior. They will be sort of doing things to try and make the best of a bad situation. Finally, we are hearing a lot of talk about Washington's departure from the IMF and the World Bank. This is something that's been goaded by Project 2025, which some of you know is this hard right project which tries to sort of push the agenda of the new US government. If Washington does leave the IMF and the World Bank, it will mean these bodies will have to be physically relocated somewhere. And that's likely to be Japan, the second largest donor to these bodies. And the symbolism of this relocation will not be lost, as now you'll have the IMF World Bank as well as the BRICS-led New Development Bank being located in Asia. And some of us would think that the exit of Washington's overbearing presence in these two institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, may well produce a more balanced multilateralism. But others would say, and quite rightly, that it would also reduce the options before developing countries in terms of who they could play off one against one another. So it is certainly not the revolutionary development that some critics of aid would like to see. It's also not something that we should lament completely, because it does open up the prospects of a brave new world, which of course we'll have to see how it pans out. I'll stop on that very ambivalent note, but that is the way in which some of us have been approaching this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Indrajit. And I hand over to Duncan.
Yeah, that's a tough act to follow. That was a brilliant overview, Indrajit. Thank you so much. I'm going to lower the intellectual level a little bit here. I think probably. I was talking to some colleagues in the UN. We do a lot of training of senior UN people, and one of them said, "Well, we're trying." And the UN, everybody is traumatized at the moment, and they're trying to work out what the hell is going on. And one of them said, is this a tide which goes out and then comes back? Is it a long-term change in the ocean current where suddenly you're swimming against the current and it becomes very exhausting? Or is it a tsunami that just destroys everything? And increasingly, it's becoming clear it's a tsunami. I'm sorry for those of you who are looking for jobs in the development sector, but we are looking at an enormous level of destruction. And that has sort of important implications. In the short term, we're talking today about the impact on the vulnerable. It's the most clear impacts are on the health part of aid. The medicines for HIV and other medicines sitting in warehouses, people starting to get sick and die, a really horrible global phenomenon of aid being cut and people dying or suffering as a result, but also really poor response to the Myanmar earthquake, another recent emergency. Now, that's partly because Myanmar's in the middle of a civil war and has a horrible military government, but it's also because humanitarian spending is under huge pressure. And then another example, what's going on in the Sudan at the moment, where the level of funding for relief in Sudan is a tiny proportion of what is needed. Appalling figures of a number of people going hungry in that conflict-driven emergency. So you're seeing crucial bits of the aid system not functioning. They didn't. I agree with Indrajit. They didn't function that great before, but they're definitely functioning worse now. In the longer term, which is what I'm thinking about a bit more, in some countries where the governments are capable, they will step up. They will do more of the health funding, more of the infrastructure. They will find new sources of investment. And that's fine. But then many of the places where aid is really crucial are places where the government is either absent or predatory. And so that's probably not going to happen. There, what you're going to see is one interesting thing, that the aid system has been, NGOs like Oxfam, where I used to work, have been demanding localization for 20, 30 years, which means, locally led development, resources and power being shifted to local organizations. And it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened for a bunch of political economy reasons around the structure of the aid industry. You're now going to get locally led localization. When you sweep away the aid structures and the aid system out of that wreckage, out of the tsunami, people are going to have to still respond when there's a crisis, when there's an earthquake, when there's an emergency. Politics will continue. Power will continue to be unequally distributed. People will contest. People have agency. So you're going to get a sort of locally led localization rather than this failed top-down attempt at localization. And it's going to be very interesting to see what emerges. It's not going to be pretty. It's certainly not going to be well paid for those of you looking for jobs to pay off your student loans. But it's going to be authentic, probably, to a degree that top-down localization has not been. So I think that's going to be one thing to watch. And that will be driving one part, the biggest part of the aid sector, what was the aid sector, long-term development. That will become locally led, I think, and also humanitarian. In terms of domestic politics, there's been a rise in advocacy and influencing in the last 20 years by aid sector organizations. It's what I do we have a new program at the LSE called Activism, Influence and Change. And that's about that. And that's why I'm talking to these UN people. That's going to be subsumed far more into domestic politics. So it's going to be domestic contestation, and that's great. That's where it should be. But in countries which are highly repressive, that's going to be very difficult for, say, civil society organizations to go it alone and challenge power in a way that doesn't lead to extreme risk. And then I think another aspect you'll see coming out of this tsunami, wipeout, is a rise in regionalism, as Indrajit said. But also increasing attention to the other sources of money, of cash, of resources, which are there already and have been massively underemphasized by the aid discourse, which privileges aid agencies and northern donors. So you will find far more attention on domestic resources, whether it's government spending or altruism, people giving huge amounts of money in developing countries through religious giving, for example, zakat in the Islamic countries, tithing in the Christian countries, completely dwarfs the volume of aid. And it's never It's not really been recognized, at least in the aid sector. It's not been studied, and governance is a mess. And that could be a really big source of the resources that have been taken out by the aid system. I think also diasporas, diasporas increase. Yeah, in the last 20 years, I think the flow of money from migrant workers to developing countries is 4 times the flow of aid now. So that will continue. And if anything, will increase, because diasporas always step up when there is need. Again, questions about who it goes to, how it's governed, but it's a big chunk of money that will carry on. So I think we need to get outside the aid bubble and actually take a fresh look at how people get through the week and the month and the year, and where they get access to money. Final point, a role for outsiders. And by outsiders, I don't just mean people who look like me. I mean people who are outside a given country and want to help with the struggle for justice, the Amartya Sen expansion of the freedoms to be and to do that Indrajit referred to. I think there's plenty to be going on with. Whether it turns into a job is something that's not yet clear. So there will always be a need for global activism, global engagement for the issues which do not work at a single country level. Things like climate change, tax evasion, illicit crime, human trafficking. These things will always need a global response, and NGOs and international organizations are much the best place to do that. Similarly with corporate malpractice by big corporations, whether they be from India, China, or America, or Britain, those kind of things, you will have a role for international activism and international action. Beyond that, I think we're going to have to shift. When you don't have money, you still have solidarity. Right now, I think it's often underappreciated that for people in struggle, sometimes the most important thing is being seen, as being recognized, as being supported morally. And I think, and with a bit of money if possible, it's a kind of old model which has fallen out of favor a little bit because of the technocracy that took over the aid sector. I think solidarity is bound to come back, and people will really appreciate it when they are in difficult struggles in their communities and in their countries, that somebody is supporting them, recognizing them, and telling their story. So I think there'll be a role for solidarity. And then finally, there's a bunch of things which do not fit into the North-South aid agenda, which are genuinely shared problems at a sort of multiple country level. Things like road traffic. Road traffic kills 4 times more people in developing countries than malaria, but it barely figures on the aid radar. Alcohol, tobacco, mental health, all of these things are things which actually are shared problems, with some countries doing better on some areas, some countries doing on others. So we might actually get to something we could actually call development cooperation, and it would be horizontal and not hierarchical, and it would be a really great use of people's time to catalyze, convene, get those conversations going about how do we help each other confront obesity, which is a massive problem in China, India, Mexico. Mexico is the fattest country in the world, right? Not the US. So these are problems which are genuinely shared, and we can, it would be a real mind shift in the aid sector to shift to tackling those things together.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm handing over to Sayed for his reflections.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for your generous introduction, and Indrajit and Duncan for insightful or thoughtful insights. So I'll be mostly speaking about how the aid got felt in Afghanistan, particularly on those inside Afghanistan and those who are kind of in the process of their resettlement cases in the United States. So as Indrajit alluded, so the US government was the major donor in Afghanistan since the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. So it contributed almost 44% of humanitarian aids in Afghanistan in 2024. And in early February 2025, just 11% of countries' humanitarian response plan for 2025 had been funded, and 24% was linked to US funded sources. So when these funds are gone, so the consequences we felt in Afghanistan was food distribution were delayed and health center were shuttered and mostly closed down, and wash system left unmaintained. So people who were on the edge kind of were pushed further into crisis. And let me give you a couple of human example of how people kind of were affected by these changes. So I spoke with widows who were kind of supported by local NGOs through health services and also their livelihood. So they say, I quote, "We were already forgotten by the international community when the US left Afghanistan, and then now even the little we have is gone." And so she is just one of the 14.8 million Afghan who were food insecure, and 21 million who lacked safe water and sanitation, and 22.3 million in need of protection services. So she's just one of those people. And recently, I was talking with a friend of mine who was working with local NGOs. So we talk, and then he say about the mass layoff that NGOs let the local population or local professional receiving their termination letter, and he was left with nothing to do. And with the current economic situation in Afghanistan, it's very, very difficult to find a job. Like even in the labor market, so when there is no construction or nothing being done, like you just survive or whatever you find. And then this friend, he was kind of like looking for ways to get out of Afghanistan, to find any dignified life outside Afghanistan, since there is no education and his only source of income is gone. So obviously, he is looking to get out of Afghanistan. And majority of people who are professional working with NGOs, they are looking for ways to get out of Afghanistan. And then on the parallel to these changes, the refugee or US RAP suspension program. So tens of thousands of Afghans, women rights defender, journalists, LGBTQ plus community, and also families of those who work with the US and international forces are left stranded, and mostly in third countries and mostly in Afghanistan. So according to IRAP, there are around 10,000 people who had received who had received their resettlement approval, and most of them were issued like visas and tickets. Some of them actually. When I was working with one of the US funded NGOs in Qatar, so like most of these people were ready to go in coming days, but when the executive order was issued, some of them were kind of returned back from the transit airports. And yeah, as it was mentioned by my colleague, like so there are 2 points that we can the development aid said there are, of course, there will be actors to fill in the gaps, like as mentioned by Duncan, the government, they could do something about it. But in Afghanistan, like there is it is a failed state and with no international recognition. So when they, let me recall one of the quotes that was issued by the Taliban leader, like we fought for, he said that we fought for independence and to give you food and to give you food and health and better life, we leave this on Allah. So the God would protect you, but independence, that's what we fought for, like fighting the Americans, he meant. And then, yeah, this is a sad scenario for Afghans both inside the country and outside the country. And yeah, in my own line of work, when I was working with Afghan evacuees, I have seen what it means that when the protection framework will have people approved for resettlement or stuck in third countries, So they're not only in Qatar and Islamabad, like in Albania. And so, yeah, it's kind of a sad situation for them. So I witnessed everything on the ground. So when we were delivering messages, like the process kind of halt and for 90 days, and it's almost over. The 90 days duration is almost over, but we haven't heard any news that it will continue. But on top of that, like people who had payroll in the United States, like who had already resettled in the United States, I think there are around 40 families, they had received their a repatriation letter that they had to return back to Afghanistan. So it greatly affected people, particularly in Afghanistan, and it's kind of almost very difficult, impossible for them to like find a way to tackle this problem that they're in right now.
Thank you, Sayed, for this really rich contribution. I think the three speakers together have really given us an overview of the different skills at which this has had an effect, the ways in which we see the effect of this both in the present as well as potentially in the future, certainly in the future, but the shape of that future impact, of course, is something to be discussed. I'm sure there will be some immediate kind of points of response for each of the speakers. Indrajit, would you like to start with some responses to your fellow panelists? And then at the same time, I'm inviting, of course, the audience to think of questions. And I already see that there's one question in the message box, so I will shortly hand over to the audience as well.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you both, Duncan and Sayed. I think as you were talking, I was reflecting on some of the things I had said myself. And Sayed, you're absolutely right. I think so much of the conversation around aid should have been and increasingly is about the context, where you find aid, who's, the state and the social factors that are, and the agents that are affected by or impacting aid. And I think this is something we've often, as analysts, we've often painted aid in one brush. It's either good across the world or bad across the world, but so much depends on where it's going and who's appropriating it and who's sort of doing things with it. Your talk got me thinking also about the very real ways in which, no matter how broken the system is, it does help people. And at the end of the day, as human beings, we cannot ignore that human dimension of aid, the humanity of aid, which ironically needed a tsunami, to borrow from Duncan's word, a tsunami to make us recognize that it's not the technocracy, it's not the bureaucracy, it's not the intellectual debates, but it is the humanity of aid that we need to recognize, and that really is something that I think contributions on this topic must bring to enrich the conversations even further. So thank you so much. And I really liked the way your talk actually followed on from the point that Duncan made, which I was quite it got me also to reflect on the alternatives that open up now. Human nature is well, I don't want to say human nature, but human beings are not, they're not just passively sitting waiting to be delivered. There's an activeness to things. It's what in other work I call the hope that really inspires their motivations, which of course is something Sara and I will be discussing later this afternoon in another panel. But I really liked Duncan's sort of way of thinking about how this might ironically and unintentionally actually support many of the locally led initiatives that folks have been trying to get us to think, whether it's locally led localization. And it got me reflecting on my own practice. I used to work with CARE, which is an NGO in India, which was supported hugely by USAID. But that was at the turn of the millennium when India's then nationalist government was trying to push for more localization. And of course, CARE's response was, that yes, we need more localization, and it was a set of unintended sort of series that came together to make CARE an Indian entity rather than an American entity led in, that was in India. But that was, at the end of the day, driven by the state as well as by USAID's own dwindling resources. I think we're going to have much more of the sort of locally led initiatives towards localization, because there is, of course, no other option. And I really got that. That really got me thinking about how NGOs, but also civil society actors across the so-called developing countries will be responding to this. And I think the point about development cooperation now being liberated from its technocracies is a really fascinating point, Duncan. I'm so glad you made it, because sometimes it seemed to me to be an intellectualizing of a problem. But I think you've hit the nail on its head when you say that there are lots of commonalities that countries share across the North-South divide. And aid agencies and aid agendas have a way of boxing them up into certain sectors that need to be put into the logical frameworks, and things need to be done to them. But who talks about something like, did you say it was road traffic accidents? Who talks about traffic accidents? And that's obviously something that needs to be done. So I mean, I can only say I was surprised at the resonances across the three presentations, and I was very happy to see how there are conversations that can happen across, coming at it from very different disciplines. As an academic, I'm almost tempted to say we should put together a special issue to a journal, but I don't want to subject my panelists to that. Thank you.
All right.
Oh.
Thank you so much, Indrajit. Duncan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, that was a very nice sort of overall view from Indrajit, so I won't repeat that. I mean, I think we were surprisingly complimentary, given that we hadn't coordinated before this. So well done, the organisers, for choosing three good complimentary speakers, even if we are all men. But there we go. So I guess some of the things I would pick out, I didn't know about the IMF, World Bank having first choice as Japan. That's really interesting. I in my Eurocentrism, I had assumed it would be Brussels or Geneva. So that's very interesting. Thank you for that. Sayed, I was really interested in what you talked about, the different modes of response. And I guess I have a question for one question each for you guys. So to Sayed, is there going to be, given that you've only got 11% of that need funded and the government is essentially, as you call it, failing, do you anticipate, or is there already happening, a kind of community-based response around soup kitchens, around pooling what you have, as we have seen in the Sudan, and it's been the main humanitarian response in the Sudan in the world's worst hunger crisis, even worse than Afghanistan. Is that emerging, and what are the institutions that back that? Is it just people in the street? Is it coming through the mosques? Is it coming through some other? So I'm just interested in what's filling the space where aid was. And then I guess to Indrajit, a couple of things really. One is actually this is also Sayed, but also Indrajit. You've got, it always worried me, working for an NGO, how many really highly qualified national people were sucked out of the state system or sucked out of the local NGOs because the conditions in CARE or Oxfam were much better and the wages were better and you had petrol for your vehicle, you could go and do things. Now that's stopped. Some of those people will emigrate, as you were saying, Sayed, and it might be that the older, more experienced people emigrate, but that leaves a flood of highly qualified people, very smart, very socially committed. Where are they going to find expression of agency? Is this going to give a sort of boost to local organization, to civil society organization, or will they go into the state and improve the quality of state machinery? I'm just interested in what happens to that pool of talent now that they're no longer working for Oxfam or management consultants or the donors. And then final thing is at the LSE we've had a lot of very traumatized students saying have we made a terrible mistake? What do we do now? Yeah, there's no jobs. I was talking to somebody today who read a kind of AI-based trawl of all the US websites to see how many jobs are currently being advertised in the whole of the United States for aid jobs, and there were 27, right, in the whole of the United States. And that is fewer than is on this call. So there are not even enough jobs to go around to the people who are on this call. So in that situation, what is your advice to the people who, after all, are paying at least Indrajit and my wages, if not Sayed's? When they asked us at the LSE, I said, well, look, don't pursue those 27 jobs because you'll go mad. Find a way of managing the next couple of years. Go and work in an adjacent, space, a state, a management consultancy, a private sector body with a view on, social justice, and then see what emerges from the tsunami, and then come back in. They're going to have to earn money because they've got massive student debts. Thank you very much. But I wonder whether you had other advice to people who are just starting their careers in this really difficult moment.
Thank you, Duncan. I think in terms of like the balance of speakers and time, I think it would be wise if I give Sayed first the opportunity to respond to the others, answer perhaps also some of Duncan's questions. Then I'm going to bring in the question that has been asked by the audience, perhaps add some more, and then I give it back to the other speakers. Is that okay? So Sayed, the floor is yours first.
Yes, I'll take the first question, that who will be filling. So I don't know much about Sudan, but like I haven't seen anything like a community kitchen or so being operated in Afghanistan at a community level. But what emerged after the re-emergence of the Taliban is like the YouTubers in Afghanistan. So they go into communities or they find families, and then they try to connect them with diasporas. So mostly then the diaspora, they kind of monthly finance their expenses. And so as well as whoever's children are going to school, so they kind of provide financial support for families. But to see this at a community level is kind of very difficult, because like what the US withdrawal did to Afghanistan is that whoever was at the economically positioned in a much better position in society, they left Afghanistan. So it's kind of a tectonic shift in Afghanistan. Like whoever was dwelling in cities, they fled Afghanistan, and whoever was living in villages or supporting the Taliban, so they are now kind of living in cities. So for them to understand this, to have a community kitchen within the city is kind of very difficult. So the only thing I see is that family from abroad helping families, but that's kind of a very, very marginal level or very meager, that they cannot like feed millions of people. And to the next question about professional leaving, so it's kind of sad moment. Whoever in Afghanistan has a means to get out of the country, they leave Afghanistan, and especially the professional, so they think that, I have this qualification or this financial means if I stay for 5 years, which the Taliban will last more than 10 years, right? So they calculate everything. So this will keep me going this long. If I leave country, I have the means. So now Germany was kind of accepting refugees until recently, but they have recently stopped it. So they're kind of finding ways to get out of the country, and then who will fill their shoes? So when there is no NGO or there is no fund for local NGOs, so there will be no shoes left to be filled. What I'm trying to say is that, and WHO recently announced that they closed down more than 20 local clinics. So those people are kind of like they're jobless. So so the doctor, they may start their own practice, but those who are working as a janitor or something else, they don't have anything to do. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Sayed. I'm just going to read out the question that was asked by an audience member. I'm going to add perhaps 2 more questions, and then I leave everybody a short amount of time to respond to whichever question they feel able to answer. So first of all, the question that was asked by an audience member. Thank you very much to the panel. This has been fascinating. Looking at the African continent, the African Union has been placing an emphasis upon domestic funding for health since 2019, for instance, in the ALM declaration, with the reduction of international aid already seen on the horizon, from 2009. However, it has been extremely challenging for a lot of member states to meet those objectives. Do you envisage these types of regional policy strategies will weather this storm? Or might these longer-term objectives fall away while countries are having to respond to this global north, USA, European aid emergency? Thank you. So that's the one question. A second one I would like to add is we have focused very much, I think, on the economic impact and the very real, tangible impact. I just wondered if people wanted to comment on the symbolic impact of saying we are withdrawing aid. I mean, what does it mean for the current world order? What does it mean, perhaps to borrow a word from Duncan, for solidarity at a kind of international state level? And finally, perhaps also inspired by the last comments from Sayed, as we know, there's a very complex relationship between development aid and migration. Let's not kid ourselves, development aid has also been used as a tool to control migration, a desire to develop countries in order to migrants and refugees out of the global north. At the same time, development aid, like funding that has been counted as development aid, has actually been used to support refugees in the global north domestically. And I don't think we have spoken very much on that impact. So in terms of those longer term impacts, how do you see that relationship between migration and development play out, either in terms of anticipation of new refugee flows in the way that Sayed already kind of hints at, or also in terms of affecting the refugee resettlement within the global north and that particular sector? So we have 8 minutes left. So if I could ask every speaker to take 2 minutes to respond to the question they feel is most pertinent to their expertise. Shall I go in the same order? Indrajit, if you would want to start, 2 minutes.
Sure. Thank you. I think if I respond to the question that just came up in the chat, yes, I think you will find more of a role that regional bodies will play. Partly this is their moment, in the sense they step in. They're not going to have all the answers, definitely, and it'll be an imperfect response, but you already look at, the East African associations, the West African associations, for instance, doing what they can to step in. And as has been said already, the reduction of aid was long in the coming. It hasn't happened overnight. People who've been sort of scanning the horizon know this was on its way. What obviously was unanticipated was the shock and the suddenness of it, which takes me to the point about the question that Duncan asked. I think where are these highly qualified INGO employees going to find employment? I mean, some of them are going to leverage the connections they've made overseas and migrate, which is a point that Sayed has already alluded to. But I think a vast majority are going to find themselves working with or seeking some sort of employment in quasi-government bureaucracies, consultants to governments, maybe, and independent, run their independent consultancies. And obviously, I think there is a market for local management consultancies or local offices of international management consultancies, which are interested in questions of economic growth, and will probably offer opportunities. Obviously, there's going to be a glut, as you can imagine. So it's not an easy answer. Advice to students. I mean, there's startups are a thing these days. So social startups or socially oriented startups is possibly one way that they can, they will not lose touch with their training, will be able to, get something going. Obviously, having an income out of it immediately is always tricky. But I think the more enterprising could turn to content creation and create meaningful content online which can be monetized. But the trick with monetization, of course, is there's an allure of polarized narratives which sells. And I hopefully students will use the training that they've got to avoid those polarizing narratives and to create meaningful content. I think I'll stop there, but thank you. Thank you again for this engagement.
Great. Thank you so much, Ingrid and Duncan. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, very quickly. I'll just take the symbolic impact question because I thought that was that got me thinking. I think aid was both a source of comfort and a source of humiliation in the past. It was very colonial. It was very top down. It was, that awful phrase, capacity building. We are going to go and build the capacity of these grateful people around the world. Always made me absolutely horrified. So there will be some sense of loss at that engagement, but there might also be a sense of relief. Especially if it is replaced by something better. It really depends what comes next. If it's replaced by genuine solidarity and a more horizontal kind of democratic form of relationship between peoples and between elites, let's not kid ourselves, then it could be a good thing. If it's just turning rich, powerful people in countries, turning their back on less powerful people in countries, then that would be a loss. But it gives a chance to reset that awful colonial tone that permeated so much of the aid sector over the last 80 years.
Thanks so much, Duncan. Is there anything else you wanted to respond to, or shall I?
No, over to Sayed.
Over to Sayed then.
Yeah, I just want to be very brief. So how the people saw aid was not just a service; it was a hope for them. So for the people on the ground in Afghanistan, like we're receiving service, it was a hope, like the better days will come. And for people in refugee camps who were waiting their turn to get resettled in the United States, it was more than a waiting process, or just hoping that something will work and then they will get resettled in the United States. So yeah, I could end this my statement with what happens when hope itself is suspended, So these people are kind of like, their hope is suspended now. Yeah.
Can I come back briefly? I mean, it's compulsory to end on an upbeat note, all right? So I just wanted to say one thing, which is that people will still be in struggle. People still have agency. People will still need each other. Something will emerge from the rubble and the wreckage. And people of good intention and good politics and smart people who've read the books and done the thinking will have a role. So this is not the end of this whole conversation, but it's a massive, what we call a critical juncture. It's a massive fork in the road. And people need to think and watch really carefully to find a good role in what comes next. But there will be a need for good people to do good things.
Thank you so much. I'm sure there's also lots of good people and smart people in the audience. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that this has been an inspiring discussion and conversation. I'm also hoping that we see the kind of reverberations of that in practices to come, because indeed we will have to make a different world at the back of this. I see some comments here, some thank yous. I hope everybody can read them. This has been such a brilliant session. Thank you very much to you all. It has been sobering, but also very practical session. What happens when hope is suspended? Gosh, Sayed, that hits very hard. It's a very emotional period, but as Duncan says, hopefully we will see some positive change from this major shakeup. Much appreciated all. I think that's a brilliant audience comment. So let's end it there. Thank you so much, everybody. And I'm sure we will continue this conversation in many different shapes and forms.